Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Cindy Arnson. I'm director of the Latin American program here. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this event co-sponsored by the Latin American program of the Wilson Center, the Brazil Institute, the Mexico Institute, and of course the Inter-American Development Bank. This discussion could really not come at a better time. The political context, which I think we all know about, is not explicitly addressed in the IDB report. I think there's great pains taken not to address it, but I think it very much shapes the environment in which the discussions over trade and integration take place and the decisions that are made in literally every country of the region. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that there is a greater feeling of urgency and even anxiety throughout the region in light of what can really only be called the greater trade protectionism on the part of the United States and a number of other countries in the world. We're all familiar, I think, with the key aspects of what have taken place over the last 20 months. First, the withdrawal of the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, something that had been pursued by the region and the United States actively since at least 2008, at least in terms of U.S. participation. The imposition of steel and aluminum tariffs on imports from key Latin American and European allies. Most recently, an escalating trade war with China, and contentious negotiations over this entire period over NAFTA, which has led to now the conclusion of a bilateral agreement between Mexico and the United States, but still no accord, either bilateral or multilateral, with Canada. At the same time, the dynamic in the region over the last decade or so has been just the opposite. There has been a reinvigorated search for deeper integration within the region and between Latin America and Caribbean and the countries of Asia. This is reflected in a number of things: the formation of the Pacific Alliance, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and Peru, 2011-2012, the signing without the United States of a renamed TPP in March of this year, and the efforts at convergence, the word that I think is used, I put that in quotes, between the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur, the other mega trading bloc in the region. We still don't know where this will lead, but it seems that the reaffirmation of the value of open markets, free trade, integration has never been stronger, at least not in recent memory. As the IDB report clearly indicates, economic integration has been a goal of the region for well over half a century, and political integration since at least probably the era of political independence. The spaghetti bowl, that's a term that's been used to characterize all of the different kinds of sub-regional agreements, has come and gone. These alliances have come and gone, but the value of commerce between and among Latin American countries remains one of the lowest in the world, something recently underscored by CEPAL. Productive value chains, as other colleagues at the IDB have pointed out, are practically non-existent outside of North America, and financial integration in the Pacific Alliance is incipient, but it is still worlds away from reaching its full potential. So I offer a special note of thanks to the Trade and Integration Division of the IDB for consistently providing the expertise and the vision that will help move these integration efforts forward. The head of the Trade and Integration Division, Tony Esteva de Ordal, was going to join us this morning. He's been called away by Bank President Luis Alberto Moreno to attend to an urgent matter, so he is not here, but we are honored, always honored to have the report's author, Mauricio Mesquita Moreno, here to present its key findings. We are also honored to welcome back to the Wilson Center Brazil's ambassador to the United States, Sergio Amaral, a dear friend of the Wilson Center and of the Brazil Institute. And it is also a pleasure to welcome our other two commentators, who I will introduce when we come to the panel of comments. Before turning the program over to Mauricio, just a quick note of thanks to my colleagues, Paulo Sotero, Anya Prusa of the Brazil Institute, Anders Biel, Catalina Casas of the Latin American Program, for their assistance in pulling this, today's event together, and special thanks as well to Camila Viegas of the IDB and her entire team for working with us throughout this process. Thank you, Mauricio.
Well, good morning. Many thanks for coming. I want to start by thanking Cynthia for helping organizing that. A special thanks for the ambassador, for taking his time to come here. I know he's in a very busy period of UN, assembly, and also to Annabelle, for taking his time. Guillermo, I think it's going to join us later on. But I want to start by saying that this is a very interesting time to be having a conversation about integration, as Cynthia suggested. It's a very turbulent time when it comes to, trade issues. But this report, came about. I mean, the idea of the report came about much earlier than, the recent turbulence, and is sort of a result of a call that we got from finance ministers that were gathered in this regional dialogue that we organized, and they came up with this idea that we need to think of, what would be today the integration agenda for the region. We're pleased with the challenge. I mean, not always we get the attention of finance ministers. Usually, they don't really dedicate too much time for trade. So, and the way we thought about it is we today have at least 30 years of data, of a 30-year experiment in terms of new regionalism, in terms of new trade agreements. Now, all the new vintage of trade agreements is started in the early 90s. So we have enough data today to say something about what has happened and what was the results of all those agreements, and to use these results to think about, what will be the agenda for the future. So we tried to structure the report along these lines, and of course, to say something about the results, we need to understand first what was the motivation behind it. Why, countries in the region were, signing these agreements in the first place. So we start then with the motivation and try to, discuss the results in the light of this motivation. Use this metric to understand if the results really met the expectations or not, and given these results, try to think, why they came out this way, and then move on to try to think of an agenda that would, improve those results. So starting with the motivation, I think it's pretty clear. I mean, even if we go further back, in the early 50s, that the main motivation behind it, I'm clear. Let me be clear about that. I mean, I'm going to focus on the economic motivation. I'm not trying to, diminish the importance of the political motivation. I think it was, play an important part on the signing of many of those agreements. But when you think in terms of only of the economic motivation, it was pretty clear. It was this idea that it was about size. We want to have a bigger market, to have gains of scale, to have gains of specialization, and to become more competitive abroad. It wasn't an end in itself, but as a means to increase competitiveness and to be able to compete more effectively in the world markets. That was present right from the beginning. I mean, when you read Prebisch's, speech in the first attempt to put this thing on the move in terms of integration, the idea of enlarged market, and gaining competitiveness was already there. So that motivation led, as you know, as this huge network of trade agreements. We started with the big five, the Mercosur, Central America, the Community, and NAFTA, and CARICOM, and then spread it to a set of other bilateral agreements between the major big blocs. So there's no doubt, that people follow up on their, motivation. The question is, what was the results of this, huge network of trade agreements? So if we look at just the descriptive statistics, I mean, without trying to assign any cause, to what has happened in terms of trade, we just look at, for instance, at very simple statistics that shows the share of intra-regional trade in the total trade of each of those 5 blocks. What we see is clearly after the signing of the agreement, there is an uptick in terms of the participation of the intra-regional trade. It has happened, in some of the agreements it was more, it was a larger impact than in others, but it was pretty clear that, it had an impact in terms of, I mean, at least there is, some evidence that, those agreements might have had an impact. As I said before, we can't really say that the agreements were causing this uptick, but, it's pretty much suggested that it was the case. So the other thing which goes, directly linked to the initial motivation is what has happened to the exports of these blocks to the rest of the world. As I said before, I mean, the motivation wasn't just to increase intra-regional trade, but to use this increase to boost exports to the rest of the world. When you look at this is a proxy of this kind of effect. We're just looking at the share of manufacturing goods of these blocks in world exports of manufacturing. When we look at that, there's not much going on in terms of an increase of the share of these blocks in the world market of this type of goods. The only agreement where we saw this effect going on is with NAFTA, the red, kind of reddish line, where, it clearly reflects the fact that Mexico expanded a lot its exports to the US. But when you look at Mercosur or any of the other agreements, it's pretty much, an electrocardiogram of a dead person. I mean, that nothing really has happened. And that's the problem. I mean, if the whole idea of this thing were to boost exports abroad, I mean, we seem to have a problem there. But as I said before, it might have, this result might be the consequence of a number of other factors. I mean, the way that GDP behaved, or movement of exchange rates. So there are a number of co-movement factors there that might have affected the results. So in order to be sure about that, I mean, we run a number of econometric exercises exactly to try to control for other factors that might be behind those results. And what we got, what we found is when you look at intra-regional trade is the bar on the bottom. And I want you guys to pay attention to this result here. This shows that after you control for other factors that might be affecting this result, the agreements had a huge impact in terms of the intra-regional trade. So on average, these agreements increased intra-regional trade by 60%. So I have to, yeah, sorry. It's, it's a substantial impact. Without those agreements, we would have much less intra-regional trade than we had before. And another important result is, usually when we talk about those preferential agreements, there's this risk of you just being diverting trade. This idea that you are importing less from the most efficient exporters and more from the less efficient exporters in the region. So we also look at that, and what we found is there's no evidence of a big trade diversion. So what has happened is those agreements also increased imports from the rest of the world. So it was, at the same time there was increasing imports within the bloc, was also increasing imports from the rest of the world. So there's not much damage on this dimension, but the most, I think, shocking result is when we look at the impact on exports to the rest of the world. So here, instead of getting, a positive impact, that was something that, people were hoping for, what we got was, a substantial negative impact for the rest exports to the rest of the world. So what is behind those results? I mean, that's important if you want to, really have an effective agenda for the future. So our, take on those results, our interpretation of these results, or the diagnostic of these results, point to this fact that there's just too much fragmentation in the way countries went about in, trying to integrate. So instead of having just one unified market, we end up having 33, separate smaller markets. We have 33 agreements in the region. And of course, by having 33 agreements in the region, you sort of diluted, this potential gain that you could have in terms of, boosting competitiveness abroad. I mean, I'm not blaming, anybody or the governments during this time for going that way. I think we all know that there were, huge political differences across governments in the region. So the way, to go, perhaps that was the most effective way of at least moving the needle, moving towards a greater integration. There wasn't political conditions to try something more ambitious. But the fact is, when you look at the economic impact, you have a problem. It's just too much fragmentation to really, get some kick in terms of competitiveness. And the problem with that is this type of fragmentation is only going to get even more dysfunction for the things that, that Cynthia was talking about. If you think of the probable scenarios we're going to have in world trade these days, we play with a number of them. In none of those scenarios, the status quo, the fragmentation status quo, is going to be, useful for countries in the region. For instance, if we think that, the US and Europe will eventually, resume this march towards mega PTAs, and we have some, evidence of that. I mean, the TPP wasn't signed by the US, but the other 11 went ahead and signed it. So if we, march towards this type of scenario, I mean, the small agreements that we have in the region are going to become irrelevant. They might be relevant on political terms, perhaps if they go deeper in terms of integration, but in terms of trade of services and goods, they're going to become pretty much irrelevant. The same thing if we have a scenario where China starts leading this move towards regionalism. I mean, not exactly as deep as, something that we have in the TPP, but perhaps some lighter agreements. But, even in this case, I mean, we're going to still face this scenario where, agreements like Mercosur or Pacific Alliance are just too small to make a difference. So we still going to see, this effect of having not much of an impact on particularly on competitiveness abroad. And finally, if we think of the worst case scenario where there is this escalating trade frictions or trade war, if you like, again, I mean, the status quo is not going to be an insurance policy for us in terms of trying to minimize the damage. Now, they're just too fragmented, just too small to serve as sort of a compensation for markets being closed abroad. So, it's clearly, there's a need there to think of ways of moving away from the status quo, from the current fragmentation we have. So the question is how to do that. So, the no-brainer would be, of course, I mean, we need to converge towards a larger agreement. And this, infograph is sort of trying to illustrate the kind of trouble we are in. I mean, even the biggest agreement we have in the region is just too small, it's just $2.7 trillion compared to any other big agreements or mega agreements we have, in the world, or even if we compare with, the biggest economies, the mega economies like China or the US. So, it clearly there's a size issue there, and the way to go, I mean, at least theoretically, will be to move towards something like, a regional-wide agreement where we're going to have at least $5.5 trillion, which is something that would give us at least a critical mass to be relevant in this kind of scenario of mega agreements, of mega economies. It looks like a crazy idea. Usually people are very skeptical when I talk about that. I mean, governments, specialists, and whatever you think in terms of people that are interested in this kind of issues. And usually what I present, the data that I present is this kind of data. I mean, it might look something totally irrealistic, but when you look at where we are in terms of integration, it doesn't sound that crazy. I mean, today we have, close to 90% of the intra-regional trade already liberalized. Now, these are, the schedule, the tariff phase-out schedule of the main agreements in the region. So we are in 2017. So we are pretty much close to the 90%. So there's just 10% left. So it really doesn't sound that crazy when you look at those numbers. But at the same time, you have to be careful not to underestimate the challenge of, getting to the 100%. And that's what I wanted to talk about. I mean, the main challenges are coming from two fronts. One front is the missing links. And here's, I think, the great paradox of regional integration of the region. The three main economies, the three largest economies, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, don't have an agreement, that are compatible with WTO standards, or an agreement that's worth of the name. So, and the three economies are almost 70% of the region's GDP, and they account for less than 2% of the interregional trade. So no wonder we just have 10% left. I mean, we just have 10% left exactly because the three major economies have too many trade barriers to have a greater share of trade. So if we don't address this major link here, I mean, we're not going to go anywhere. There are other important links. I mean, not as important in economic terms as this one, but no agreements between Central America and South America and the Caribbean and Latin America. The other big obstacle is the issue of rules of origins. As you know, is the necessary evil of trade agreements. You need to have that, otherwise there will be triangulation. All the imports are going to go through the country with the lowest tariffs. So we need the rules of origin. And the fact that we have 33 regional agreements, or preferential trade agreements, that led us to 47 rules of origins that oftentimes is product specific. So it's a nightmare in terms of enforcement, has a real economic impact. I mean, a lot of estimates put this impact ranging from 2 to 15% in terms of tariff equivalent. It's like you're imposing a tariff of almost of up to 15% on intra-regional trade. And of course, this has a major impact in terms of value chains, of regional value chains. This is something that politicians, governments in the region keep talking about, and we need to develop regional value chains. But it's no surprise that we don't have much going on, given the amount of bureaucracy of rules of origins we have in the region. So convergence means addressing these two challenges here. And there's different ways of addressing those challenges. And of course, we try to build a menu of options that would address different political ambitions. I mean, we are fully aware that perhaps we don't have the political will to go to the most ambitious. So we try to build different options from the most conservative, moderate approach to the most aggressive approach. So the least we could do is, just use the existing agreements, not negotiate any new agreement, and try to extend the accumulation of rules of origin between them. And I'll explain that quickly with this example. For instance, in this case, we have, Colombia, Guatemala, and El Salvador have an agreement. Colombia, Costa Rica has another agreement, and Costa Rica, El Salvador, and Guatemala has, the Central America Common Market. So if Guatemala imports from Costa Rica, say textiles to build, shirts and then export to Colombia, Guatemala cannot use the preferences of the agreement that Guatemala has with Colombia because it's using inputs from a country which is outside the agreement. No? That wouldn't happen if Guatemala used from El Salvador and build the shirts to export to Colombia. That would be zero tariff. So what happens here, we don't know which one are the most efficient supplier. So we are forcing Guatemala to import from El Salvador. And of course, you are creating obstacles for developing regional value chains. So extended accumulation means allowing the different agreements, countries in the different agreements to import from members of other blocks and still benefit from the preferences when they're exporting to other members of the bloc. So in this case means that having an extended accumulation agreement between this agreement have these three members with this other agreement of the Common Central Market. So this will be the least we could do, and there's already some agreements that have this provision in the region. The problem with that is that, you're still gonna have 47 rules of origin, and the impact of this kind of arrangement on trade is bound to be minimum. So you're not addressing also the missing links, you're just, keeping the status quo, but making a little bit better. So the other options, and the further you go east, the better the gains of trade are gonna be. So the other options will be moving to a single rules of origin, so try to harmonize all the rules of origin, of course would facilitate the gains. Then you could start filling the missing links and allowing, for instance, Brazil and Argentina to negotiate agreements with Mexico. They're already doing something like that. I mean, they have partial agreements. They are trying to, increase the scope of these agreements, but still they are not, aiming at a true preferential trade agreement. But it will be something voluntary without any sort of coordination. There's also this dialogue going on between Pacific Alliance and Mercosur, which is, exactly point on that direction. But, we are not trying to make an effort, a regional-wide effort. So the most ambitious would be to try to have something coordinated and move, towards a regional-wide agreement where you harmonize rules of origin and you fill all the big gaps. There, you can really have, an impact on terms of trade. So what type of agreement we are thinking of? I mean, here we are sort of taking a page from the Pacific Alliance. I think one thing we learned in this last 30 years that, the European model clearly didn't work. I mean, customs union clearly didn't work. Supranational institutions, parliaments, I mean, they all, let's say it, most of them are zombie institutions today. I mean, they clearly don't have, any kind of, significant impact. So the idea was, you need to move towards something like a plain vanilla free trade agreement, intergovernment arrangements, and focus on the trade of goods and services. And of course, you don't need everybody to join at the first time. You can just rely on, on the big guys, let's say it. Now, if you can get Pacific Alliance and Mercosur, and within them, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico negotiating, you have enough critical mass, enough momentum to get this thing moving. And of course, everybody else wouldn't like to be outside, an initiative like that. So it's pretty much something that could go on. And you would, of course, be flexible in negotiations and try to harmonize rules of origins, the preferences. And one key requirement, I think it's important given the credibility that the region has in terms of regional integrations, that you would do exactly the same that the Pacific Alliance did. I mean, you would require that any country that wants to join an initiative like that has to have bilateral agreements with all the other members that are participating in the initiative. So, Mexico would have to negotiate an agreement for Brazil, and the same thing with Argentina. And then, after making this down payment, you can try to move something more ambitious. So it will be something, a step-by-step approach. So what exactly the type of gains we can expect from this kind of move? So we try to look at two dimensions of these gains. One is the impact on the regional value chains. So how much of an agreement that would harmonize rules of origin and fill the gaps, how much this would impact in terms of the amount of inputs Latin American exporters are using to export abroad. So what we found is this on average, and that is the first bar there, this would increase by 9%. That means that Latin American exporter would increase the use of Latin American inputs by 9%, which is not a small number, particularly when you take into account that today, the use of local inputs is pretty small. So it's not something that you want to leave on the table. And the other dimension, which I think is also important, is the impact on the intra-regional trade. Of course, the impacts vary across sub-regions, but on average, we are talking about something around 4% in terms of the increase of inter-regional trade once we move towards that move. This is just the direct impact. If you think about the general equilibrium impact, all the secondary impacts that this kind of move would have on the economy, we can get close to 10% in terms of increase of the inter-regional trade. And again, I mean, it's not a panacea, but it's in a time where inter-regional trade has been falling by 20% in the last 5 to 6 years. I mean, if you think about 10%, it's something that you don't want to, again, leave on the table, and particularly in an environment where trade frictions are, increasing fast. And to have a sense of how much of an insurance policy a move like that will be for the countries in the region, we also run this exercise where we try exactly to, think of a trade war scenario. When we start doing that, it looked to us something like, very unlikely to happen. But, as time went on, it became much more realistic than we thought at the beginning. So what we simulated here was a 20% increase in tariffs in the US and retaliation from the rest of the world. The 20% was pretty much on target. Just to highlight one result, so in a scenario like that, if we stay in the status quo with all this fragmentation, exports from the region would fall by 13.4%. If we move towards, conversions, the fall will be 8.1%. So we would limit the damage in 40%. So again, not a panacea. I mean, we could expect the Latin American market, $5 trillion to compensate for the rest of the world, but it will be something that at least would alleviate the pain. So just to conclude, I mean, there's no doubt that these initiatives of the last 30 years were very effective in terms of boosting inter-regional trade. It didn't generate too much of trade diversion, which is a good thing, but at the same time, it wasn't very effective in terms of boosting our competitiveness abroad. And clearly, we think that has a lot to do with the fragmentation that has happened during this period. I mean, conversions is clearly the most rational solution. There's many ways of going about, a more ambitious, less ambitious way. But clearly, if we want to really move the needle, we need to think of terms of a LAC FTA, a regional wide agreement that would be sort of a plain vanilla free trade area, that would focus on goods and services, and this could have some important gains, both in terms of boosting regional value chains, as in terms of boosting intra-regional trade, and can also prove it to be an important insurance policy in an environment where there's a lot of uncertainty about where the world trade is going to go. Thank you very much.
I'd like to now invite Ambassador Amaral to offer some comments. The format of the morning is a little bit changed from what we had originally announced. The Brazilian foreign minister is in town. I think everybody knows that this has been the week of the meeting of the United Nations General Assembly. So he will offer some remarks, take one or two questions, and then we'll turn to Anabel and Guillermo. Okay, thank you.
Seated. So good morning. Cynthia, first of all, thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion. But I would like to make some comments on the work which has been achieved and which is a very important contribution by IDB and by Mauricio Mesquita's team. Indeed, we know each other quite well from some time. We worked together in assessing the Chinese presence in Brazil, in South America, when I was the chairman of the China-Brazil Business Council. Andrés Suárez was here, worked very much with you at that time. And I think my comments will be made from the point of view of the user. What does that mean? This means that there are many negotiating processes underway. And in order to make this process to advance, we need some inputs, some subsidies, and these are important subsidies. I'd like to thank the Brazil Institute also. Paulo Sotero has become a reference for Brazil in Washington, and I'm very happy he's also involved in this. I liked very much the summary you made of the different attempts for integration. That's very didactic. I think it's very useful for whoever wants to understand, to talk about Latin America attempts for integration since the 60s. And it starts from an assumption, which I share, which is that a unified regional market is something important for the region. And the question is how to achieve that. And it's very important for economic and political reasons. For economic reasons, because it brings, as it was shown, trade creation, scale gains, competitiveness, although not all of these goals were achieved on a similar way. And it's also, from political point of view, a web of common interests, which increase the bargaining power of the region in different negotiating process around the world, mainly at a time in which protectionism seems to prevail or risks to prevail. And you examine two of the tools, and I think in a very detailed way, which are the proliferation of preference trade agreements, this web of preferential trade agreements that exist in the region, which, as you show, and I agree with that also, have been useful. It's better than nothing. And they create a platform for future agreements. And there are benefits for that. And the second is a more sophisticated discussion on rules of origin and the accumulation of origin, which are two key tools to discuss the effort for integration. What's interesting is that although you explore many options, what is happening now is something that happened to Mercosur by the late 90s, when there was a vivid discussion on whether should be an extension of Mercosur to other countries, let's say that horizontal growth, or whether we should deepen what we had in a more limited number, for a more limited number of countries. You don't approach this dilemma very clearly, but I think that's by my understanding of the document you proposed, is that that's what's at stake. Should we go to a plain vanilla approach, including a larger number of countries, or should we be more concentrated on a smaller number of countries who may have this mass effect and which may grow faster because the platform is already there? I will anticipate my support for this approach, and this means the central contribution by this convergence. And I saw that in recent documents from Puerto Vallarta, people are more ambitious and they accept the word of integration between Mercosur and Alliance for the Pacific. They have this mass effect, which you underline along your work. It's more advanced. It's interesting that the trade between Mercosur and the Alliance for the Pacific is growing by 18%. That's a very high percentage. I think we never reached that before. It's well advanced because most of this trade among the two entities are free trade. It's underway. There's no need for any further agreement, what makes things easier. It's politically relevant, not only from the fact you mentioned that preferential trade agreements would be of almost no significance at the time of the mega trade agreements. And it's politically relevant also because if you don't do that, and if we let Mercosur and the Alliance for the Pacific to go their own separate ways, we will increase and reinforce a division in South America, which is an economic and political division. It would be a kind of a line of Tordesillas. You may remember the Tordesillas agreement, which set a line from the north to the south, and South America, half of it Spanish, half of it Portuguese. And this is what was happening, or what may happen, or there's a risk that this happens in case Alliance for the Pacific and Mercosur go separate from each other. And I think it's very important. There is an additional political relevance, which is the fact that the joint participation of countries that represent, as you mentioned, $4.3 trillion, or 80% of GDP in Latin America, around 80% of population and of the territory, they would have a much higher bargaining power in any negotiation, either with different groups which are undertaking mega negotiations, or bilateral. And that's the case of China. And I think that China is perhaps a silence in the work. I don't know what, I can imagine you did that on purpose, but China is very relevant for the discussions about integration. I'll come back to that later. Now, if we are united by the same purpose, which is integration, the big difference and the big question mark is how? How shall we make more progress? It's not very clear because there are many possibilities. And I think in this respect, we'll have to be very clear on how we want to proceed. And it's not an exclusion. Perhaps you may keep two approaches. One is go deeper in some areas, and I suggest that we might be prepared to go deeper in this integration, convergence between the Alliance for the Pacific and Mercosur, but at the same time provide some support for other countries, mainly Central American, Caribbean, to catch up, to progressively integrate it to this main process. This is perhaps something that we might take into account. I think that this very good work, and emphasize that very much because it's the best thing I read on integration in Latin America, I think it might benefit from an enlarging of the scope. Enlarging of the scope in two directions. One is China. China cannot be absent, simply because trade of Latin America with China is increasing, or has been increasing, or was around 18% in some years, much higher than intra-block trading in the region. So if this trend continues, there's no way we'll get anywhere in this effort for integration. We will integrate to China, not among ourselves. So this is something that I think we should take into account. Not in order to oppose China or try to reduce the presence. The presence may be, and I think it is, not perhaps for all countries, very important. But it is the impact of China to the integration process and how this may be, I would say, diminished. Take, for instance, some of the figures you have shown, that regional trade in or within Latin America has fallen by 26% between 2012 and 2017. Okay, now let's have a look at what was going with China by that time. Trade with China by that time grew around 18% per year. Second, from 2007 to 2012, there were in Brazil, this is according to the study we make of the Chinese presence, investments in Brazil during this year grew considerably. We received in Brazil, well, at least $60 billion were announced. As you know, the announcements do not necessarily correspond to what happened in fact. But in the case of Brazil, I think we can assume that represented $30 billion. The increase in trade and investments, do they have something to do with this reduction of trade by 26% intra-trade in Latin America? It's more or less at the same time. How can we say, why has it fallen? Is it possible to explain that without taking into account China? I don't know. I think we might gain in verifying this situation. And second, I think it's very difficult to talk about trade within Latin America without taking into account the role by investments. Investments, as you know, bring more density to the relationship. And I think that some of the efforts which were made, for instance, the so-called IRSA effort some years ago, now it has declined, might say, but IDB knows quite well about that because you have been following this. What is the impact of investments among countries to the development of trade? And I think we should consider, and you are more prepared to do that than anyone, either state investments in infrastructure, which happened. Did they bring more trade? Is it possible to assess that? And the state-induced private investments, which are going on. And it might go faster if there were more clear inducements for that. In the area of logistics, for instance, in the area of financing, I think investments are an area which may try or help us understanding what the right policies might be, mainly at the moment in when there are new opportunities for investment. And in this case, I think it's useful to mention, for instance, the partnership in agriculture. That's something very important. Brazilian agriculture, up until now, made a revolution, but this revolution stayed in Brazil. And now I think it's time for the Brazilian agriculture to go beyond that and to export services and technologies in agriculture, and there are many countries that are interested about that. And the second area is defense. There are many possibilities for an exchange between countries, between private companies in the area. So, what I like to, as a point for further discussions, is the use of having as a first focus, a first step, this approach, this convergence between Mercosur and the Pacific Alliance, and going further, as you do, with trade facilitation, with investments, regulatory framework for investments. And this is underway. If you take the declaration and the plan of action of the presidents of the Alliance for the Pacific and Mercosur, which took place recently in Puerto Vallarta, it's a very ambitious plan of action, which includes the elimination of non-tariff barriers, the regional chains of value and accumulation of origin, facilitation of trade, regulatory cooperation, commercial promotion, and so on. It goes up until, which I think is an exaggeration, cultural issues. Now, this is a list, perhaps sometimes ambitious, and sometimes, but other times unrealistic, but there is need for an assessment of that. And I think the IDB might be prepared to do that. And what we did, I personally pushed very much for the further participation of IDB in this process of the alliance. And we have also set up a project with the Pacific, with the Atlantic Council. I don't know whether there is someone here from the Atlantic Council. It might have been very useful because they would consider as a complementary to what, a complementation to what you are doing to assess some of the political implications, not political in the sense of political differences or convergence, policy implications of what's going on. How is the best way to approach this process, which is already underway, which does not require any further agreement, and which much easier to handle than, for instance, try to go with this extension of FTA plain vanilla, because what would be the forum for that? We might create a kind of OAS negotiation process with 33 countries of different interests, different policies, and with much less weight. But on the other hand, America in a circumscribed number of 8 countries. So I think there are two processes, and this is, I'm trying to raise a lot of hypotheses for further discussion. How could we incorporate the majority of countries in Latin America to such a process? And I think the IDB has also, again, a role to play, helping these countries to catch up and helping these countries perhaps to develop further in a more organized way, more preferential trade agreements in order to prepare for a platform to, at a certain point in time, converge with the dominant in terms of mass, of size, of volume of trade of the Mercosur and Alliance for the Pacific. I'm very sorry to have to leave you because I have a keen interest on this. I've been working, as you know, with the president of IDB on that, several discussions we had, and we pushed the Mercosur countries to also have you as the secretariat for this process of integration. I've been pushing with the Atlantic Council for a project together with some other Latin American countries, and I think that Washington, let's say, the institutions which are in Washington have a very significant role to play in this process. I'm really, I don't know whether it's worth, I would not like to anticipate what I'm sure will be a very good discussion. I would think about going unless you have one or two questions, because I'll have to leave.
Perhaps we'll take one or two questions from the audience for the ambassador before he leaves. If you'd like to ask a question, please identify yourself and wait for the microphone for purposes of the webcast. Let's go here and in the back, and then we're done.
Hi, I'm Daniel Crocker. I'm with the American Foreign Service Association, but I should also qualify that I'm an active Foreign Service officer with the U.S. Department of Commerce. And what's posted to Brasilia as commercial attaché when we were working on the free trade agreement of the Americas, which is, it almost seems quaint to say that. Ambassador, I appreciate your remarks, and I do want to follow up later on a question with regards to investment in infrastructure to the extent that that has an overriding impact on regional integration of supply chains. But in particular, with regards to the trade growing with China, I've heard voiced concern, and I'm wondering if you can validate this, that growth in trade seems a little bit asymmetrical in the sense that it might represent largely commodities export from Latin American countries, including Brazil, and then the importation of very high value-added manufactured goods, which makes the actual trade figures a little bit distorted. Thank you.
One sec, we'll take the other question. And then
Okay.
back there.
I'm Annie Kayaban Wilderman. The title of the voluminous document says Caribbean. My question is, even if the title says so, how much of a discussion do you guys have, the staffers have, in producing it, if you ever even consider the Philippines? I ask because
If you included the Philippines.
Oh, the Caribbean?
because, sir, as a young staffer supporting a very young mayor, he told me he wants Mardi Gras in Olongapo City, and we made it happen. And we were successful in our development projects, absent funds from the national government, and thank you.
I couldn't understand. I'll try to answer to your question, but I recognize that perhaps this goes beyond my capacity and the scope of this meeting. Now, you raised to the first question, I think you raised a very important issue, which I have been dealing with for 5 years from the point of view of the private sector. Now, there are two factors there. One is that of geography. And I'm going to talk from the point of view of Brazil, and I'm not familiar, there are different situations. But we have what China doesn't have, which is water and land. So we have a very powerful agriculture, and we have many mineral commodities, mainly iron ore. And that's what they export to China. And they need that. So there is a complementation, a clear complementation. And I remember that, I think it was one of your presentations in São Paulo, that you raised that, the economic complementation. This brings sustainability to this relationship. But of course, since, first, if we complain with Europe because they don't buy our commodities, we cannot complain about China if it does. This is my first point. The second point is I totally agree. I don't want to have a colonial relationship with China. But I would say this is partly our fault. Because during these 5 years, I have been accompanying many visits of high-level officials from Brazil to the US, including presidents. And I remember all of them say the same thing. Oh, our relationship, economic relationship is very good, it's growing, but this does not include so many value-added products, which is true. 90% of what they export are commodities. But at the same time, and the Chinese immediately respond, yes, our relationship is very good and we have to include more value-added products. So what I ask myself, if both agree, why is that not happening? And it's not happening because we were not able to present very clear cases, either to have a clash or to have a solution. Because we always complain. We're not happy, and we complain about the European Union because they don't buy our commodities, about China. But what are the cases in which we presented very clear situations? In the area of, I don't know what, food industry. We cannot export to you processed food, or we cannot have our factories in China doing that. We didn't present. We complain, but we have not presented. If we had presented, I would be able to say China doesn't allow. In the case of some commodities, it's true. In the case of soya, that's true, because we pay a 2% tariff to export soybeans, and we pay or have a 10% tariff in the case of soya oil. But it's a matter for negotiation. And I think we have not been very successful. But in other case, when what's at stake is Chinese investments in Brazil, we told them you cannot buy land at the extent you intend to buy. And they said, okay. You are not allowed to bring labor. They say, okay. They don't argue. In some case, perhaps in the case of trade, they argue. But if you say, we do not want this, we're not going to either to argue or to make a conflict out of that. That's my experience, at least. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Ambassador Amaral. Please, a round of applause. Terrific. Thank Thank you. This is wonderful. Thank you. I'd like to invite Guillermo and Anabel up to the panel and Mauricio, why don't you stay here? All right. Well, that was wonderful. Actually, Ambassador Amaral mentioned an initiative of the Atlantic Council. I'd like to mention by way of public service announcement that the Wilson Center and the IDB have a co-produced report on financial integration in the Pacific Alliance, which is no longer available in hard copy, but is available for download on our website. And we'll also be collaborating with the Trade and Integration Division on two meetings in 2019, one on what it means to be an associate member of the Pacific Alliance, what's happening with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore, what are the sort of real benefits around that, and also on this issue of Pacific Alliance and Mercosur integration. So I am now just really delighted to welcome Anabel Gonzalez and Guillermo Malpica Soto to this panel. You have their bios. They are on our website. I'm also hoping that Mauricio will let us put his PowerPoint up on our website, available for download. Both Anabel and Guillermo have extensive practical experience in the area of trade negotiations and integration. Anabel was the senior director at the World Bank's Trade and Competitiveness Global Practice from 2014 to 2017, and she also previously served as Costa Rica's Minister of Foreign Trade between 2010 and 2014, which was Luis Guillermo? No. Laura Chinchilla's administration. Guillermo similarly brings a wealth of experience serving the Ministry of Economy here in the Mexican Embassy in Washington. He has been the Director General for International Trade in Services and Investment in the ministry in Mexico City since 2008, has participated in WTO, OECD, Pacific Alliance, a host of negotiations on behalf of the Mexican government. So we will start with comments from Anabel, take Guillermo, and then we'll open this up to a more broad discussion with all of you, and we'll involve Mauricio in those discussions as well. So, Anabel, por favor. Opa. Too enthusiastic.
Yes. So thank you very much, Cynthia, for this invitation to be here. I have to confess that I am one of those people who have negotiated a lot of those agreements that Mauricio was referring to, starting with Mexico in 1991. When we did the first attempt at reaching an FTA. And then also, of course, participated in the FTA negotiations many, many years ago, which, of course, if they would have happened, we wouldn't be here, sitting here talking about this. I'd like to start by congratulating Mauricio and his team for the report. I particularly like three things about the report. Its timeliness, its evidence-based analytics, and its pragmatic approach. And let me say a word of each of them. And on the first point, we know that trade frictions are undermining confidence and threaten to derail the recovery and depress medium-term growth prospects. And while Latin America is not really at the center of the high-stakes escalating trade and investment confrontation, prospects for the region are troubling, more so given its high dependence on the US and China, which collectively account for about half of Latin America's exports and imports. So I think that in the face of peril, the motivation to explore new openings, strengthen partnerships, and redraw economic cooperation provides a silver lining to this gloomy scenario, if you wish. So in that context, even though that was not the intention of the report, it results as a very timely input into this kind of discussion. The second point that I want to make is that while there is, of course, a very vast literature on Latin America integration, this is the first report that I know of that looks with great detail at the impact of the region's preferential trade agreements on intra-regional trade, on trade diversion, and on extra-regional exports. And its findings, I think, are very relevant. In particular, the point that it makes that considerable progress has been made in liberalizing intra-regional trade on the one hand, while most of the positive impacts of extra-regional exports come from preferential trade agreements involving large partners outside the region. And this is a point that I will want to come back later. I also think it's very relevant finding that a renewed integration effort in Latin America could serve as an insurance policy in case of a scenario of increased global trade frictions. And the third point that I want to make is that, in terms of why I think this is a very relevant report, is that any effort to strengthen regional integration in Latin America can only succeed if it is anchored in a pragmatic approach. And I think that the report makes the case, if you think the whole sort of emphasis of the report of moving from a mosaic of small agreements to a larger effort is precisely that. It's an effort to moving towards greater pragmatism. But I think in particular, I like the reference that there's no need for all countries to be involved in the negotiating process since the beginning, though of course it should be kept open for others to join. That it should work more towards a free trade area rather than other types of integration projects. And of course, stay away from building supranational institutions. There are plenty and not that effective as mentioned. So those are 3 points that I like very much. Let me now add 3 additional comments focused on the rationale for integration, for a renewed effort to integration in the region, on the content, and on the political economy. And I'm starting also from the point, which is the same point I think that the report makes, that Latin America can reap important benefits from further integration. So let me start with the rationale. I think that for many developing countries, participation in global value chains have brought economic benefits, as we know, in terms of enhanced productivity, sophistication, diversification of economic activity. And unfortunately, as we also know, Latin America and the Caribbean have lagged behind other emerging regions in GVC participation, and intra-regional links are particularly weak. So while Mexico and Central American countries have integrated in production networks with North America, GVC participation in the region as a whole mostly consists of supplying relatively unprocessed natural resource-based inputs into value chains. So, and although new technologies are impacting the future of manufacturing and GVCs as well, I think that there is still opportunity for Latin America to maximize its participation in global value chains and to leverage technology transfer as a means of learning and innovation, something that, as we know, is one of the key challenges of the region. So, as strong regional value chains may be an important intermediate step to strengthen GVC participation, I think that in addition to scale and specialization, a particular, like integration should also be guided by facilitating the development of supply chains. So this lens of supply chain, I think, should be very much present in thinking about a renewed effort to integration. And this is related to the second point that I want to make, which is about content. And we know that structural and policy factors determine participation in international production networks. So in the case of some of the structural factors, such as size of market or distance to large hubs or level of development, are of course outside the hands of Latin American countries. But policies do matter, and in particular, trade and foreign direct investment policies are relevant, as are improvements in customs and logistics, in service competitiveness, in intellectual property protection, and others. So the report rightly emphasizes, in my view, the importance of lowering tariffs on intermediate goods as a key objective of trade integration efforts in the region. And I think this is correct, of course. I do think, however, that the complexity of some of the less ambitious forms that were suggested is probably too much, and it's probably not cost effective. And maybe better just to focus on unilateral reduction of tariffs in intermediates. And Canada did something like this at some point. They put together a list of intermediates and they say, okay, we'll go to 0 here. So maybe just to say that. So in any case, I think there are 2 points that are relevant in terms of cost, content. One is that trade costs in Latin America are high, and of course Mauricio has worked a lot of this. There are estimates that suggest that it's equivalent to 200% ad valorem tariffs. And non-tariff barriers play a role in increasing trade cost. So the report makes a good case for focusing on trade facilitation in the region, and I definitely agree, and that the IDB has had a strong leadership and commitment in this area. But I also think greater focus on non-tariff barriers is important. And the second point in terms of content is that several studies suggest that it's not all trade agreements that are effective in underpinning global value chains. It is deep, comprehensive trade agreements that are important. And here, I am not sure how this aligns fully with the idea of a living agreement. It may be that that is the case, because you could have a core nucleus of disciplines and then add others as time goes by. And the third point that I want to make, and the third and final point that I want to make, relates to the political economy. And I think that, as I was mentioning correctly, in my view, the report proposes that not all countries need to participate since the beginning in all stages of the negotiation, though it should be open to everyone, and that's good. And it indicates that a critical mass with gravitational pull, which includes clearly, because of sheer size, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina is needed, and that I agree. And I think in that sense, the convergence process between Pacific Alliance and Mercosur is a positive step. But I do think that we need a catalyst to make this happen. And I think that the estimated gains of a LAC FTA identified by the report will not be enough. And not even, I think, the increasing trade frictions may be enough. I think that, in my view, the window of opportunity may open when the Mercosur countries enter into a deep and comprehensive agreement with an advanced economy. And I say this because I think that this will align most countries in the region with a model of modern, deep, comprehensive trade agreements, and will also set them in the line of tariff liberalization that will encompass almost all products. There will be exceptions, yes, but not 10% exceptions. There will be real implementation, not as sometimes happens in our own agreements. So I do think that this will be a very important moment for Latin America to take advantage of. And this may happen, hopefully, or this should have all of us routing for the Mercosur to conclude the agreement with the EU, or to do an agreement with Canada, of which they have started in initial conversations. In the meantime, I think that most of the work should focus on reducing trade costs, greater relevance to the trade facilitation agenda, greater relevance to the NTB agenda. I think we'll likely prepare the stage for when I hope that moment will come. So to summarize, I think that to maximize the chances of success, 3 considerations may help. Bring the GBC lens to bear more on the rationale of the integration efforts. Focus on trade cost reduction, including non-tariff barriers, plus services opening, investment, and the disciplines that are needed to underpin GBC. And then leverage the right timing to launch the initiative for renewed Latin America integration. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was wonderful. Guillermo.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. I would like to start thanking the opportunity to share a few comments on this very interesting report. Thank you to the Wilson Center and, of course, to the IDB, and especially to Mauricio for the opportunity to talk about this very useful, timely report. I think it's it goes in line with what Mexico has been doing in terms of trade policy, but it provides like an important analytical tool to to basically put into a framework what we have been doing, perhaps not that structural throughout our years in trade policy negotiations. I think that is perhaps the most the first comment and the most useful element of this report. We have been following a path of negotiations that basically describe what you have been presenting in your report. First, a number of negotiations, basically with bilateral FTAs, and then a process of convergence in our FTAs. First, with Central America, we had 3 FTAs with Central America. We were able to have a single FTA with Central American countries, then bilateral FTAs with Peru, Chile, and Colombia, and then was materialized into Pacific Alliance. Some sort of convergence, but not, perhaps not very intentionally driven, more or less as a result of the trends of the international trade policy discussions. And let's remember also that these exercises of convergence perhaps come as a side products of other efforts that didn't succeed in the past. No, we had perhaps I have been negotiating for 20 years, and perhaps the first exercise of negotiation that in which I was taking part was FTAA in Miami, and then in Panama and Puebla, and then it was a very ambitious process, of course. Then I think we took the long road towards integration by doing perhaps blocks of FTAs. Let's also remember that Pacific Alliance is exactly a side product of a larger exercise that was called Arco Pacifico, no? Among 11 countries. So what this tells us is basically that we need to have an intentional strategy to go towards integration with Latin America. No, we cannot go basically reacting to the political situation. We're in the middle of a transition at the end of an administration, at the beginning of another administration that is very different in many aspects. And this type of reports that provide like a very clear path towards integration with Latin America is definitely very useful at this moment. We have been also witnessing a new process in terms of how integration has been developing in Latin America, and the exercise of Pacific Alliance has been has provided very important lessons in that regard. For instance, the participation of the private sectors of the different countries to push and to have the memory of this intention to work towards a higher level of integration. We have the examples within Pacific Alliance of a number of annexes proposed by the private sector of the 4 countries, precisely to work on issues that you mentioned in your report, such as regulatory coherence. No, for different sectors, for cosmetics, for pharmaceuticals, for medical appliances, and others. So I think it is important also to consider this more permanent way to work towards a convergence, and that is by taking into consideration the possibility of using the private sector, the business communities of the Latin American countries as catalysts of this integration process. And finally, to take into consideration what has been successful, I think Pacific Alliance is in many ways an interesting exercise for us. It is definitely because it has two very important elements. It has been successful in the implementation of very specific projects throughout the years. It started in a very erratic manner, like basically without the idea of having an FTA among ourselves, but basically covering projects aimed at increasing integration and coordination among the Pacific Alliance members, and then having very important projects that were implemented in a successful manner. That has not been the case of other FTAs that we have with the region. I think this is something that we have to take into consideration to have an exercise of periodical review of where we are in this type of blocks. And then the other important element of Pacific Alliance that I think is important to take into consideration in this idea of having a more structured path towards Latin American integration is the different levels of engagement. And it is related perhaps with what you were mentioning in your report. One important feature of Pacific Alliance is precisely that it offers different levels of engagement. You can go basically through only the path of a free trade agreement, and that is what we are doing with the associate states, or you can go into a deeper process of integration, the type that we're having within Pacific Alliance members and with the countries that are seeking accession to that broader and deeper process. So I think we have many elements out there. The experience of my country has been in many ways very similar to what you described here, but it's very important to have a structured manner to propose a path forward for our countries in the future. So I will leave it here and perhaps wait for questions.
Great. Thank you to you both. Obviously, very qualified and experienced practitioners in this arena. A number of people, and Abel, others, have mentioned the word political economy, and I want to come back to a more sort of central issue around politics and take the advantage of being chair to ask the first question. AMLO has been elected in Mexico. Brazil is in the midst of a very polarizing and fragmented political season leading to the first round in just a couple weeks. Argentina is in the midst of yet another financial crisis that that raises the possibility of President Macri, who has kind of spearheaded all these free market reforms, not being re-elected next year in national elections. So there's this part of like, okay, doesn't changing leadership in these three major economies play a huge role, and how do you think about that? Are there any indications of the way this might go, so these are not just policies of particular governments, but policies of states? That's one question. The other question is that, in the United States and elsewhere, the backlash against free trade is sort of undergirded by this sense that globalization has created winners and losers, and that the costs of globalization are simply too high. We don't need to go into detail about how that is expressed politically, but that's out there. So in a political sense, if this process of deeper integration within the region is going to have a real chance of succeeding and being accepted by the publics throughout the region, how do you address that sense that there are winners and losers, that the winners in free trade are the multinational companies, the economic elites? How do you ensure that the benefits of more open and free trade are more broadly shared? We could probably have a separate panel discussion on that, but I put that out there, and I think in fairness, we should take maybe 2 more questions in this first round from members of the audience, and then we can come back to the panel. Wait for the microphone. I see Benjamin's hand, and then this gentleman, and then that person in the back. I can't see your face, but I can see your hand. So introduce yourselves, and yeah.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Kreutzfeldt, a Wilson Fellow this year, and I listened to part of it online, so I may have missed small points, but looking quickly through the report, I'm missing, these are metaphors, dots, road, and map, but I don't see, I'd be interested how important the calculation of cost for infrastructure transport comes into this, because you can reduce barriers, but you still can't get an item from A to B. And I've done business in the past in China. 20 years ago it started when there was very little infrastructure there, or it was very difficult to bribe people to take things from A to B. And nowadays it's improved, and in Latin America it hasn't improved so significantly. So I wonder how much that weighs in on maybe even more significant an advance than the than the treatises.
Great. Right here?
Hi there, Bernie Fasio from the University of Chicago. I was wondering that, well, you guys mentioned a lot about the Chinese role in the region. It seems as though it's the product of trading trends happening within Latin America and elsewhere. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the US role in this integration process, whether that is happening right now or in the future. Thank you.
U.S. role in the disintegration process. But anyway, back there, or in spurring, actually in spurring as the insurance policy. I think it was Annabelle who mentioned that. Go ahead, in the back.
Thank you. I'm sorry for hiding behind the people in front of me. I'm Steven Zonizer. I work at the U.S. Department of Agriculture Economic Research Service. Thank you for a very wonderful panel this morning, and congratulations on the publication. I had two questions. First, it's sort of related to the transport question, because I know you've done research on transportation in the past. And it's how, on a relative basis, is this question about connecting the dots more or less important than the transport question that you have in your previous work, and to what extent are they complementary? And then second, I wanted to ask about connecting a particular set of dots between Brazil and Mexico. Why is it that that hasn't happened already? Is there something that people are frightened of by connecting those dots?
Great. We have a terrific set of questions and issues on the table. Let's do this in reverse order, perhaps. Why don't we start with Mauricio, then Guillermo, then Annabelle.
Well, thank you all for the comments. I don't think I will be able to answer all of them. Let me start with the ambassador comments. I just want to perhaps raise this issue that, I'm saying that the dialogue between the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur, it's a great step forward. It's a way to go. It's a way of addressing this issue of fragmentation and try to move in terms of convergence. But I still think, first, I think that they still lack a little bit of ambition. I mean, the declarations are still, way too vague, and, there's no clear targets there. And I think it would be, nice if we could, have concrete targets in terms of, reducing tariffs, improving trade facilitation, and so on and so forth. But, I think it's important to understand that, the only countries that don't have agreements in the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur are Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. So we come back to this issue, whether through the Pacific Alliance or through a bigger, Pacific Alliance, Mercosur, to a bigger initiative. If we don't solve this paradox, and this comes to the question about why Brazil and Mexico don't have an agreement, or Argentina, I think if we don't solve this paradox, I think it's going to be very hard to move either on the the Mercosur Pacific Alliance setting or in a bigger setting. And when writing this report, I was hoping that the changes in the political environment and the political leadership in the region, and the change in political leadership in the U.S. was sort of giving a window there where we could perhaps solve this paradox. On the Mexican side, I think it was pretty much clear that the fact that you have 70% of your exports tied to just one partner, it's not a good thing, no matter the partner, no matter who the partner is. So I think it makes sense for Mexico to try to, move towards, diversifying its markets. I don't see much of a, an adjustment cost. That's, economists speaks. I don't see much of a social cost in terms of Mexico signing an agreement with Argentina and Brazil. It already paid all the adjustment costs with, EU, US, Japan. So it only has to gain in terms of reducing the trade diversion it's having towards the US or towards the EU. So I mean, I think it pretty much makes sense. I always hear this argument, not from Guillermo, but from people I talk in Mexico, in the government, private sector, which I think it's a legitimate argument that Brazilians, Argentinians are not to be trusted. I mean, in trade policy terms, and I think they are right, given the record that I say we because I'm Brazilian, but clearly our record in trade is terrible. In the last 10 years, made it even worse. So we have a reputation problem there. But again, before, I think Mexico has this issue. I mean, the U.S. was a very trustworthy partner. It doesn't look like that anymore. So, and at the same time, Brazil and Argentina went through, political changes. A couple of months ago, I was more optimistic about that. The problems the market is having clearly sort of dimmed these prospects. But again, I think there's a change in thinking there, and the fact that we went through this backlash, we already had our backlash. We already had our populist backlash. What has happened with Kirchner and Lula and Dilma, it was pretty much, in this direction. I mean, raising tariff, wasn't exactly tariffs, but all non-tariff barriers they could get hold of. So, and the disaster is clear. So I think it was a very powerful experiment to show that, look, I mean, closing the economy down, it's not something that's gonna solve the problem, it's only gonna make it worse. So I think, both in Brazil and Argentina, I think there's a change in terms of, thinking on how to address trade policy issues. So, and of course, both Brazil and Argentina were left totally isolated from all this, PTA wave. So, they need to, having Mexico on board and having an agreement with Mexico, it's a major achievement for them. So, I think that I'm hoping that there's a political window there in terms of, allowing that we solve this paradox. And once we solve this paradox, I mean, we might, be able to be more ambitious in terms of, addressing the conversions for the whole region. I agree with Annabelle's point that perhaps signing an agreement with Mercosur, signing an agreement with the EU might be, a good down payment to sort of address this reputational deficit that the country has. But I've been also advocating both in Brazil and Argentina, and I think for the first time in 15 years, we have some, political space to do that. That both Brazil and Argentina have to do something unilaterally, even before talking about preferential. I mean, they can, pretty much cut their tariffs in half and still have a lot of room to negotiate trade agreements, with everybody else. But there's always this argument, well, we cannot do it unilaterally because we need to do that, in a negotiation, preferentially or, bilaterally. But no, I mean, most of the agreements are signed between countries that have, 5% on tariffs on average tariff. So Brazil has 11. Argentina, it's the same thing because they have a common standard tariffs. So if they cut in half, there's a lot of, movement to go, a lot of, elements to negotiate. Yeah, so it doesn't undermine the preferential dimension of liberalization. So they do need a down payment, either doing unilaterally or, signing agreements with the EU, Canada. The EU has been Brazilian-Mexican soap opera has been going on for, decades. I don't know if it's going to happen, but at least unilaterally they can do it. I mean, it's up to them to do it. The thing that came up in all the comments about, infrastructure, non-tariff barriers, trade facilitation, I fully agree with that. I mean, we did a lot of work on that. And the thinking behind it when we did this work was, I mean, there's no point in trying to make, the agreements in the region more rational, because the political divergence was so, high that, we had, as I mentioned, we had, the PT government in Brazil, we had the Peronistas in Argentina, Chavez. So it was, to have any discussion, serious discussion about how to rationalize the web of agreements we had, it was, a waste of time. So we sort of pragmatically decided, so if you're going to talk about integration, let's talk about infrastructure, and there's huge gains to be there. Let's talk about trade facilitation. And so we did that. I think it's still a very relevant front. We have definitely a lot to do that, both nationally as regionally. The bank has been trying to, for ages, to try to give more rationality to initiatives like IRSA, and to have regional projects and regional infrastructure projects. But the reason of this report was pretty much the sense that, well, now perhaps we have this window to talk not only about issues that are not politically sensitive, but let's try to address this inventory that resulted from more than 30 years of integration, and make it more rational and relevant, given that the world has changed. We have all the value chain things. We have the big economies. We have the mega agreements. When Mercosur was created, it was a totally different world. It perhaps would make sense to have a smaller agreement. But these days, I really don't see the point, unless you go to the political side and have something that goes to free movement of labor. That perhaps would make sense. But just trade and just trade and investment, I don't think it would survive as a relevant initiative. The other thing, just to conclude, the China thing came up, both an ambassador and other questions. Yeah, I mean, of course, the fact that China became such a big partner in the region reduced the importance of intra-regional trade in the region, and perhaps made governments less keen on trying to address this issue. They were exporting quite a lot, so it wasn't an issue. It wasn't a pressing issue for them. These days, I'm not so sure. I mean, after the commodity cycle turned into its downward phase, I think there's more of a pressure there to try to look at other fronts. It's not just China. And even China, as some of the questions here raised, I mean, there's a number of structural problems in the trade with China. I would say, 80% of that is just comparative advantages. But there's also an agenda there in terms of trade barriers, of the relationship with China that need to be addressed as well. But I don't see any incompatibility entre moving on with our the country's relationship with the rest of the world, and having an intra-regional agenda as well. They are not incompatible at all. I mean, you can move, and of course, and they can be self-reinforcing. I mean, if we have the region with a really unified market, we have more bargaining power to negotiate with any other external actor, and the region is going to be more competitive to take advantage of all those trade agreements that are out there. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Very briefly, 3 comments on the questions and comments raised. First of all, on the backlash versus free trade, and how to change this narrative of winners and losers. I think Latin America has an important opportunity to be a voice for free trade, and basically the challenge is to incorporate elements in the integration processes that make us a more inclusive region in terms of what we negotiate. The set of disciplines that we negotiate have to incorporate these new elements in the inclusive agenda. How to incorporate in a serious manner provisions to make small and medium enterprises to participate in a more active manner in these processes. We have some provisions in some of the newest FTAs, but these provisions are still very timid in their effects. Just basically best endeavors. How to incorporate other issues of the international discussion related to trade, for instance, gender and trade, environment and trade, labor and trade, anti-corruption provisions, which are elements important to address some of the criticism that this path of free trade has had in recent years, and also try to find ways to incorporate competitiveness in the agenda of regional integration processes. We have, as an experience in our countries, perhaps a set of free trade agreements, and then separately projects that basically are designed by a specific administration, and then they disappear, and new projects are created in terms of how to improve infrastructure in the region, how to improve logistic chains or logistic platforms. We need to incorporate those discussions into the framework of our formal integration processes to give them permanence. I think on the role of the United States, I think it has not that they have sought that, but they have had a cohesion element, a cohesion effect in our relation with other Latin American partners. We have seen that, for instance, in the case of our negotiations with Brazil and Argentina. We have had for many years very different attempts to have a closer trade relation with Brazil and Argentina, and finally we're having a clear intention from both parties to go ahead in this agenda. We are in the 9th round of negotiations with Brazil, in the 5th round of negotiations with Argentina, and I think that is a result of this cohesion effect that I was mentioning, and also a constructive basically the other effect that the U.S. Today is having in our participation in other integration processes in Latin America. It has been the creativeness. No, I mean, we have been challenged to design new ways to tackle very specific problems in the trade agenda that were not part of the discussions in a negotiation before, and these new ideas can be useful in the context of our processes with Latin America. I think that's important also.
Perfect. Annabelle.
I'll just address one of the questions, because I think my colleagues here at the panel have addressed the others very well, which is, what is like the political economy of trade liberalization in the region? And aside from the point that Mauricio was making, I think that if you go to almost any country in the region, the issue is not, I am opposed to free trade, but rather, how can I take advantage of the opportunities of free trade? And that is, I would say the claim of most Latin Americans is how they know that there's a new economy out there. They see the benefits of that new economy, but not all of the population has the conditions to participate in those benefits. So to me, there's a part of it that it relates to the trade policy agenda, and Guillermo was mentioning some of the things on SMEs and women and others, but there's really issues of domestic policy. Domestic policies to enhance the skills and the capabilities of the population to be able to participate in these benefits. And I take the example of my own country, where you have a lot of young people participating in business process outsourcing brought about by a large number of multinationals in the country. But in order to be able to participate in that, you need to be able to speak English and or French or German or Italian or Mandarin or what have you. So the skills agenda, capabilities agenda, the education agenda more broadly is very relevant. The second point of these sort of flanking policies, if you wish to take advantage of the opportunities of free trade, relates to competitiveness. And here in Latin America, we could also have a different panel on about improving the business climate, the business environment in the region. And the third point relates, again, to this area which IDB has been working for ages, which is connectivity, how to connect the region better through physical and digital infrastructure. So, you know, and the countries that are able to work in these three areas, they are in a better position to take advantage of the opportunities of free trade. And I think that the discussion in the area is more around these topics rather than the type of narrative that we see here in the US.
Okay, unfortunately, we're out of time, so I invite you to approach the very distinguished panelists and ask them a question, exchange a business card, but first, please join me in thanking all three of our speakers.